Please be mindful of the following content warnings. Discussions and depictions of ableism, discussions and depictions of mental illness or distress, discussions of disassociation, specifically derealization, discussions and depictions of depression, discussions and depictions of anxiety, discussions and depictions of prejudice against houseless people, discussions of murder and ritual sacrifice, mentions of drug use and addiction, a depiction and various mentions of a severed limb, a mention of the National Guard committing war crimes against protesters, a brief mention of anti-Palestinian violence and oppression, a mention of a forced dental extraction, mentions of queerphobia, and discussions of the crushing reality of late-stage capitalism, some of which will be depicted on screen. Also, it probably goes without saying, but the following video will contain spoilers for Night in the Woods. Night in the Woods has often been described, ironically, as a video game that's difficult to describe, and I can understand why. It is somehow a coming-of-age story about young adulthood, as well as a horror game, a deeply moving story about the complexities of mental illness and trauma, as well as a story about how difficult it is to be neurodivergent, as well as a story about the crushing reality of living under late-stage capitalism, as well as how living in a small town in the Rust Belt of the US complicates things even further. So, it can be a little challenging to just sum it up in a sentence or two. In fact, this game has so many different themes and narratives going on within the text that it's easy to see why so many different video essays have been written about it. However, there is one particular angle that, to my knowledge, no one has explored yet, and I believe it is worth doing so. I had a deeply visceral reaction to the game during my first playthrough. I can still clearly remember how I sobbed during the Nightmare Eyes scene, drunk off my ass just like Mae, and filled with self-loathing. I think it's safe to say that I chose to play this game at the perfect time in my life. For example, if I had played it in 2017 when it first came out, when I was still a senior in high school, despite being very much not okay, I don't think I would have been able to fully appreciate everything this game is, nor would I be able to relate to it so heavily. Being disabled and in my early 20s like Mae, currently taking a break from university like Mae, and also jobless like Mae, gave me valuable insight into her character as someone who knows and understands a lot of what she is going through, as well as giving me insight into the narrative surrounding her as a whole. This game is brutal for me at times because it refuses to pull any punches, and yet still manages to find a balance between being too harsh and critical or too lenient and full of excuses for Mae's behavior. It is both sobering and cathartic at the same time, and that's really not an easy thing to pull off, especially concerning material focusing on a neurodivergent person going through a rough time. But it is possible. However, I've noticed that a lot of people who play and discuss this game have a tendency to either place all of the blame on Mae for everything, or place the blame entirely on everyone else. This is flawed, obviously, because it lacks nuance, but also because it completely ignores one of, if not the biggest factors, shaping the circumstances of Mae and everyone else in Possum Springs. In this video essay, I will be discussing how this game is, in my opinion, an incredibly sobering and at times deeply painful exploration of disabled flaws, or specifically neurodivergent flaws, and all the stigma and conflict that comes with it, as well as providing a greater outlook on the oppressive systems that harm us and treat our lives as disposable and ultimately worthless. It's about the way capitalism as a whole seeks to demonize those undesirables who are a drain on resources, or who don't contribute anything to society, usually meaning unemployed. It also deals with how many working class, low-income people will often throw other vulnerable people under the bus, blaming them for the problems capitalism causes, often seeking to offer us up as a sacrifice to appease some malicious, hungry higher power in order to save themselves. I'll also be talking about community and disabled and working class solidarity. But for the most part, this is about the whole. the hole in the world, and how we get out of it. Before we get started, I just want to make sure we're all clear on what I mean when I call Mae disabled. I went through the definitions of the medical model and the social model of disability, the definitions of neurodivergent and how neurodivergent is included under disabled, and mental illness is neurodivergence and disability in my video essay on Life is Strange Before the Storm. I will be linking the video down below. I also talked a bit about the problematic nature of psychiatry and the benefits of anti-psych politics and thinking, while still expressing my feelings on the importance of labels within our highly political society. Quite frankly, I don't feel like doing all of that again, so here's the short version. I use the word disabled to basically mean anyone who has a physical or mental impairment or quote-unquote deviation from the norm that presents systemic, social, institutional, and legal barriers and challenges to fully interacting with society in a way that is perceived as quote-unquote typical and quote-unquote acceptable. These impairments or deviations may require treatment, the use of aids, and/or accommodations, or they may not. I realize that the quotation marks are doing a lot of heavy lifting in this definition, but that's also kind of my point. Disability and what society considers disabled or mad or crazy or mentally ill or whatever is heavily reliant on cultural and social norms and the kind of world we live in. Neurodivergent is basically everyone who is mentally disabled. And in my book, and many disabled people's books, that includes people with mental illnesses, or people who experience mental distress, or madness, or whatever term you want to use. Because in the context of the way our society functions, that is more or less accurate. Night in the Woods focuses on 20-year-old Mae Borowski, who has just dropped out of college and returned home to find that her small hometown of Possum Springs isn't how she left it, and neither are her friends. Stores have come and gone, there's a new pastor at the local church, and Mae's friends, Greg and Bee, both have new jobs that don't leave much time and energy for their old band, and new lives that Mae knows nothing about. And on top of everything else, Casey Hartley, their former band member and another friend of Mae's, has gone missing. Greg seems to think he just hopped a train and ditched town, the way he was always talking about doing, but Casey's parents seem to think something more sinister has happened, judging by the missing persons posters they've been putting up. Something interesting about the way this game's plot unfolds is that the majority of it involves you as Mae going around and talking to the people of Possum Springs, and occasionally participating in activities with them, before picking a friend to hang out with for the day, Greg or Bee. Regrettably, you cannot hang out with Angus daily, and you only get to do it once towards the end, which kind of sucks if you really like Angus, which I do. But I guess this is meant to be because Mae and Angus aren't as close, and are really only friends because he's Greg's boyfriend. I've often heard people say how weird it is that nothing really happens in Night in the Woods until the end of Act 2, or that the pacing of this game doesn't make any sense. I would argue that these people are kind of missing the point regarding what Night in the Woods is actually about. I would argue that the murder cult and the arm left out by the click-clack are all just window dressing to surround the larger plot in this game to further accentuate its themes. Fundamentally, this game is about the violence of capitalism and working class life, particularly paired with Rust Belt American life, and it mainly uses Mae as its protagonist to be a case study to further examine that. This game is also about Mae's brain and Mae's life, and how factors of ableism and capitalism have shaped her life and her circumstances, and how it continues to shape them. Mae isn't forthcoming about why she left college to anyone, even to you as the player, which causes friction amongst Mae and some of the people in her life, particularly her mother, and Bee. Mae also refuses to get a job, which is stressing out her mother and father, who are trying to make ends meet in their working class family, and also worrying about losing the house. Bee is angry with Mae because she perceives her as throwing away the one thing she wants more than anything, for seemingly no reason, or because Mae just got bored. Bee had to basically take over the family business when her mother died, and her father became so depressed he could barely get off the couch. So that put her plans for college on hold, seemingly for an indefinite amount of time. Now, I completely get why Bea feels the way she does, and why she's so angry at Mae, in particular, when Mae doesn't always see things from her perspective. Mae really seems to struggle to put herself in other people's shoes and empathize with them, and can occasionally be a little self-centered. It sucks because you can tell she isn't doing these things on purpose, just like she isn't trying to completely bulldoze past social cues and be rude or insensitive. It just kind of happens sometimes. But that doesn't mean she isn't responsible for how her actions hurt other people. Mae is also very blunt and impulsive, prone to risk-taking behavior, aggressive, and destructive at times. She also has a terrible sense of self-preservation. People have headcanoned her as multiple kinds of neurospicy over the years, and I don't think labeling her in a specific way changes the bulk of my arguments and analysis, because no matter what, she is neurodivergent and disabled. If the piles of evidence dropped throughout the game don't confirm that, then her conversation with either Bea or Greg, depending on who you spend the most time with throughout the game, definitely does. But despite all of that, I must say that I really do see a lot of my ADHD and autistic traits in Mae, and that means a lot to me. Particularly because so rarely do we get to see autistic characters in particular, especially autistic female characters or characters who are not men, who are complex and problematic and multifaceted, who are allowed to be flawed without being villainized. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this game is excellent at balancing the line between trying to hold Mae accountable and also being kind and humane towards her. And as a disabled woman, or not really a woman, but identify as a disabled woman because I identify with the gendered experiences of disabled womanhood, and that's how I'm treated and perceived by people, and also as a mad woman, that really means the fucking world to me, because it is just so rare. Mae finally tells either Bea or Greg why she left school in the final act of the game, and it's the same reason she nearly beat a kid to death with a baseball bat in senior year. She tells us, and her friend, that I was playing this video game, you were like dating ghosts or something, and I was really into it, played it like 24/7, until this one afternoon and suddenly like something broke. It was just like pixels. The characters on screen, I felt like I knew them. They weren't people anymore. They were just shapes. And their lines were just something someone had written. They never existed. They never had feelings. They never would exist either. And it felt so sad. Like I had just lost these real people. And this whole thing we had, it was just me, alone. And that realization, like, dumped me out of the screen and into real life. Went outside, and the tree out front, I looked at it every day. It was like a friend outside the window. And now it was just a thing. Just a thing that was there. Growing and eating and just being there. Like all the stuff I felt about the tree was just in my head. And there was some guy walking by, and he was just shapes. Just like this moving bulk of stuff. And I cried. Because nothing was there for me anymore. It was all just stuff. Just stuff in the universe. Just dead. And then the next day was that softball game. And Andy was the pitcher when I was up, and he was just shapes too. Just lines someone wrote. Like, nothing in there. And I was so scared and angry and just, I don't know. Before I knew it, I was on top of him, smashing his face in with the bat. Just shapes. We hear about this a few times throughout the game, especially from other characters, not from Mae herself. When Lori M asks her why she did it, she doesn't give her a straight answer, which is frustrating, but also unfortunately understandable given how she knows the truth will sound to people. She is justifiably afraid of being perceived and treated as crazy. Also, I think she doesn't really know how to explain it to people so they'll understand. But the thing is, Mae is already being treated like she's crazy, in a sense. People just tend to chalk it up to her being more bad than mad, to borrow a phrase from a Game Assist video essay. But it's not like describing more obviously recognizable signs of mental illness or distress, like severe disassociation, is going to change this. In fact, it'll probably just make it worse, given the way psychosis in particular is perceived and demonized by many people. Mae mentions how she came home because at school she just kept seeing shapes, and she wanted to be home where everything was familiar. I think Mae's tendency to want things to remain the same is heavily tied to her experiences of derealization and her anxiety surrounding it, which completely makes sense. If nothing feels real, or things being real feels temporary, then you want things that are familiar and comforting to you to remain the same, so you can try and take comfort in that. But things don't always stay the same. That's just a fact of life. The food donkey goes under, Past Abilities gets replaced by a taco place, and Mae is getting older. Time is passing, and Mae is an adult now, who doesn't fit in with the other adults, because in a lot of ways I think Mae doesn't feel like she's ready to be an adult, which I can wholeheartedly relate to. Because she's disabled, because she still wants to do kid things, like bounce on a trampoline with Germ, and particularly because she doesn't know how to fit into capitalism. She's having a hard time with school and the idea of holding down a job because of her mental distress, and because of the fact that work and the academy are not accessible for disabled people. She wants to be seen as an adult by the other adults around her, but she doesn't know how to handle the responsibilities and role of adulthood, and as a result, people infantilize and judge her. I think the two central relationships that Mae has with Bee and Greg are really fascinating in regards to what they reveal about not only Mae as a character, but Mae as a neurodivergent person. Let's start with Bee first. Now, Bee, as I mentioned earlier, is absolutely jealous and resentful of Mae for giving up college for seemingly no reason when Bee was forced to stay home and work at her father's store, basically taking on all the responsibility because her father is unable to do so. She views Mae as this wrecking ball of chaos that takes no responsibility for her actions and doesn't care about how what she does affects other people. Now, she has a bit of a point, but Bee also lacks the full picture regarding what Mae is dealing with and how her fear is preventing her from taking responsibility. I'm not trying to say that makes Mae right or excuses all of her actions, but I'm trying to offer some context which is desperately needed. I think Mae often avoids taking accountability or taking things seriously because that would mean having to think about things changing and acknowledging herself as a person with a future who needs to take on responsibilities and move into adulthood. It would mean having to learn to acknowledge reality and not disassociating from it, not just seeing things as shapes. I might be slightly projecting here, but fundamentally, I think we can all agree that Mae is struggling to cope, and Bee just doesn't get the full scope of it. Not that Mae is being super upfront through the majority of the game, but that's understandable. There's also the fact that Bee is putting her anger and resentment towards her father, even though he isn't really the one to blame either, and more broadly, capitalism, onto Mae. Because Mae is the more comfortable target, because she's there, and in Bee's eyes, she hasn't suffered the way Bee's father has, so she has no excuse to be slacking off. I find this situation in particular really interesting because it's something I've experienced multiple times, being a disabled person who is unemployed and living on disability. People, particularly working class people, who have to be constantly employed and working minimum wage jobs full time, get very angry and resentful of you as a person they perceive as slacking off and being lazy. It's an attitude that is firmly rooted in the ableism of eugenics and the idea you have to prove your worth in order to be allowed to exist. Parasites, leeches, useless eaters. The common working class person, hell, even sometimes the common working class so-called leftist, has nothing but contempt for the person who insists on lazing around and mooching off everybody else's hard work, disability be damned. And they often don't realize, or just don't seem to care, how they're basically parroting Nazi rhetoric regarding disabled people. Your disability is not an excuse. It's something I've heard a few times, and it begs the question, what exactly do y'all think being disabled is like? Do you honestly think I'm just having the time of my life over here, living it up, and raking in my unearned money? Well, boy, do I have some fucking news for you. Disabled people in Canada get about $1,500 a month, if you're on disability, or at least I do. I can't confirm if it's the same for everyone in every province. And if you're wondering if that's enough, particularly given how high the cost of rent is in big cities nowadays, spoiler alert, it's not. And when I tell you I struggle to work, especially full-time, especially in bright, noisy, hectic, busy environments where I have to constantly talk to people because it burns me out, believe me, I'm telling you the truth. People with disabilities are twice as likely to live in poverty than those without disabilities. We are not your enemies. If you want to be angry at someone, be angry at the system, be angry at the 1%, be angry at billionaires, be angry at capitalism, but don't be angry at us. B has been trapped by an appalling profit-driven medical system that essentially has put her and her father in the position of being bled dry by the cost of B's mother dying. She's been trapped by being born into a working-class family in the first place, trapped by the fact that university tuition costs money that she doesn't have. She's trapped by the fact that her father has no way to process his loss and deal with his grief, in an individualistic, capitalistic world where therapy costs money and often isn't trauma-informed and doesn't take factors of systemic oppression into consideration. And fundamentally, she's trapped by the fact that you have to work to live, and if her father can't do it, then she must. So she is trapped and forced to give up on her dreams, forced to give up on college and getting out of Possum Springs. She tells Mae during their conversation in proximity that she's doomed, and it's very easy to see why she feels that way, because capitalism is designed to make you feel that way, and then sometimes it even becomes a reality, but you can't give up. No matter how hopeless things seem, there is always something worth fighting for. Even if you have to physically throw yourself on the spokes of the wheel of capitalism, it is worth it. But it's much easier to fight when you have friends, community, and people to rely on. We'll come back to that later, believe me. At the Fort Lucerne Mall, we see that B and Mae actually often balance each other out. B encourages Mae to be more sensible and grounded, and Mae helps B loosen up and not care about the consequences just enough to have fun. Proximity may be how their relationship started, but I actually don't think that proximity is all they have. They work well together and clearly care deeply for one another. They just need to communicate and work on trying to understand each other's circumstances and points of view. And then at the polar opposite end of the spectrum, we have Mae and Greg. If B and Mae are occasionally too different from each other, then Greg and Mae are probably a little too similar. It's pretty clear based on context clues that Greg is neurodivergent, most likely bipolar, as B mentions, and that's probably a huge part of why Mae and Greg get along so well and communicate so effortlessly. There is truly nothing like the Madness Network. But unfortunately, the flip side of that is sometimes you also share weaknesses and unhealthy coping mechanisms as well. Sometimes you encourage and enable each other's unhealthy and toxic behavior because you don't see anything wrong with it. Because those flaws also exist within you, and you haven't identified them as flaws, or you just don't know how to deal with them. Sometimes a person's depression and suicidal ideation magnifies and encourages your own, and sometimes their reckless, impulsive, and self-sabotaging behavior only makes you want to give in to your own unhelpful tendencies. Because, to put it simply, agreement feels good. There is a reason why addicts often surround themselves with other addicts, because the unsober and unaware addict isn't going to judge you for your own reckless and unhealthy behavior, or try and get you to stop. And that feeling that you don't have to check yourself, because you don't actually have a problem. You aren't doing anything wrong. Everyone else is just overreacting, and look, here's the proof. That feeling will kill you if you let it. This isn't me trying to say that neurodivergent relationships are inherently unhealthy or toxic. On the contrary, they can be life-saving. But if you both have the same unhealthy tendencies and bad habits and they go unchecked, it's often a recipe for disaster. And we see this quite clearly with Mae and Greg, with the knife fight and breaking into the food donkey to steal an old robot and attempting to bring it back to life with an also stolen car battery. What's interesting about these situations is that, first of all, Mae being involved with any of these things is optional, depending on whether you choose to hang out with Greg each afternoon. And secondly, it's implied in the narrative that Greg only does these things because Angus is away and he gets bored and lonely, which is incredibly understandable. Greg strikes me as the kind of person who doesn't do well being alone with his own thoughts. And the scene in the woods after the knife fight and the crossbow shooting kind of solidifies that. He tells Mae, "I try really hard. Angus, needs me. He needs a Greg badly." I just don't want to lose him. Not ever. I don't know what I'd do. I don't want to screw this up. Maybe I'm inconsiderate. Maybe I'm not good. I've got, no future if it was just me. When I'm awake at night, I listen to Angus snore, and I stare at the ceiling, and I think about how I'm a complete piece of shit. The scene hits me really hard because, first of all, same. And second of all, I think it's a good example of how Greg's self-hatred and internalized ableism. I call this internalized ableism because what I think Greg hates the most about himself are expressions of his neurodivergent traits, i.e. being reckless and impulsive, because it's often what gets him in trouble with Angus. And then this leads to a downward spiral. Mae is slightly different in the sense that she can occasionally be painfully unaware of how her actions affect others. But when she gets in her head about how she's ruining things, we see her spiral in the same way, and her emotions carry her into an outburst. While Greg often destroys out of the need for an adrenaline rush and the love of chaos and a need for impulsivity, Mae usually destroys out of anger and a feeling of helplessness or anxiety. A great example of this is at Donut Wolf, when she recognizes that the vibes are off between Greg and Angus, but she doesn't know what to do about it or how to fix it. So she has what might be a meltdown or a breakdown in the bathroom. Fear and anger seem to go together a lot for Mae, and this leads back to the incident with the baseball bat back in high school when she beat up Andy Cohen, lashing out in anger because of her fear. Now this leads me to the part of the Greg and Mae storyline that I have beef with. The part where Mae gets blamed for everything by both Angus and Greg, which is unfair because while yes, Mae was enabling him, it wasn't her idea to break into the abandoned food donkey and make the robot. As I mentioned earlier, Greg actually does all of those things without Mae's help if you choose to hang out with Bee both times. And despite this, Mae is blamed by Angus for Greg's behavior as if it's single-handedly her fault, which just isn't fair. Greg tells Mae about how he and Angus need to leave Possum Springs because it's a small town with no opportunities and basically no other queer people, and they've been trying to save up to move, which is understandable. But him putting the blame on Mae for putting a wrench in this is completely unfair in my opinion. When he tells her that she needs to let him change, I suppose he sort of has a point in the sense that Mae, as I mentioned earlier, is reluctant to change, and she's reluctant to the idea of Greg leaving because to her it represents the loss of familiarity that sustains her when everything else feels out of control and scary. It's frankly ridiculous for him to act like Mae is single-handedly trying to sabotage him and Angus's plans, because that's just not true. But as much as Mae can be guilty of enabling Greg, she also comforts and anchors him. In the woods, when he starts to spiral, convinced that he's a bad person, she tells him that he is good. And maybe he doesn't fully believe it, but she also provides him with a distraction to break him out of his downward spiral. And maybe it's enough. For just a little while, it's enough. So we've talked about Mae herself and her relationships. Now let's discuss the town of Possum Springs a little bit. Now, as I've already mentioned, Possum Springs is meant to be a town in the Rust Belt of the US, although it's unclear which state. For those of you who don't know, the Rust Belt refers to, quote, the geographic region of the United States that was long the country's manufacturing, steelmaking, and coal-producing heartland, but that underwent dramatic industrial decline that resulted in widespread unemployment, increased poverty, decay, and population loss. Because the Rust Belt is defined by similar economic experience rather than natural borders. By the way, I despise and debate the use of the word natural here because, bestie, we made all of the borders up. None of them are natural. Its boundaries are debated. However, it's generally viewed as encompassing a large part of the Midwest, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Missouri, Ohio, Wisconsin, along with Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and some parts of New York. The region's prosperity sprang from its abundance of natural resources, including coal and iron ore reserves, as well as rivers and lakes that abetted transport and travel. From the 1950s to the 1980s, it experienced significant economic decline and dislocation, largely because of foreign competition, increased labor costs, failure to modernize equipment and infrastructure, and technological advancements that replaced workers. Taken directly from the Night in the Woods wiki, quote, Possum Springs was originally settled in 1793 by beaver fur trappers, most notably brothers John and Stephen, who were attracted to the fresh springs, which the town bears its name. The town itself was officially founded in 1795. Possum Springs used to be a boom town that underwent significant development due to a coal mining industry there. However, Possum Springs started to stagnate when the coal mine was shut down. This caused the unemployment rate to skyrocket and for Possum Springs to start going under. For example, multiple buildings are closed, such as the Food Donkey, and many characters express the stagnating state of the town." End quote. Possum Springs is bleeding dry due to a lack of resources and fundamentally because of late-stage capitalism. People are losing jobs because the mines have shut down and because businesses can't afford to stay open. Businesses can't afford to stay open because people are losing their jobs and in many cases leaving town, so they're losing business, and the cycle continues. All of this tracks with information about the history of most Rust Belt towns. In Austerity in America, Belts of U.S. Capitalism, Stephen R. Gray Gibb writes, quote, "America's manufacturing belt since the 1970s has hollowed out to become America's Rust Belt. The country's industrial base was sacrificed by America's wealthy elite in their effort to advance the neoliberal utopia of the global economy. The visible decline of the Rust Belt serves as a reminder to American workers of the cost of demanding industrial democracy." End quote. So basically, in a nutshell, due to capitalism, workers' wages were cut in order to increase company profits, and then everything got fucked. Union jobs, which used to make a decent living, what Stephen R. Gray Gibb refers to as a middle-class wage, essentially started to disappear because they weren't making the companies enough money. And then the US labor movement was damaged by, quote, "decades of unimpeded industrial outsourcing and anti-labor legislation," end quote. Industrial outsourcing meaning hiring another third-party company to do manufacturing work that is usually done by the original company's workers. Gray Gibb also points out how unions were blamed by many for the economic decline of the Rust Belt, stating that, quote, "the ideological resistance of organized labor to unfettered capitalist rule is believed by many to be the cause responsible for the country's industrial decline. The neoliberal reasoning goes that if there were no unions and U.S. workers earned low wages, then U.S. corporations would not have to relocate south and abroad, a logic that surely blames the victims of corporate restructuring for demanding the realization of the American dream. The freedom and prosperity of the U.S. industrial democracy proves too significant an obstacle to corporate growth." I don't know if the industrial democracy was actually ever as much of a democracy as he claims. I'm kind of skeptical of that wording, but I wasn't there, so who knows. If anyone is unclear on the actual definition of capitalism, essentially it means that private actors, usually rich people who own companies, Marx called them the ruling class, own and control the means of production. Then they employ the workers who sell their labor power to the ruling class for a smaller sum of the profits. Essentially, you as the worker don't actually get the value of what you make through your labor. That goes to the owner. You only get paid a wage by your employer for your labor. This is exploitative and frankly bullshit. Now, Possum Springs is by no means a rich or well-off town, and we can see that most of the people and families in Possum Springs seem to be working class or lower middle class. One character, Lori M., even comments that Mae lives in the rich part of town, which Mae is taken aback by because her family certainly isn't rich, so we can only imagine where Lori M. lives. Mae's house is quite big considering it has 3 floors, and Mae actually has a house as opposed to Greg and Angus and Bea and her father who live in apartments. But as we progress through the game, we learn that Mae's family is in danger of losing the house because the bank essentially tricked them into taking out a bad loan, and both Mae's mother and father are working low-wage jobs. It's pretty clear that Mae's parents, particularly her mother, wanted her to go to college very badly. Mae's mom mentions that she is the first Borowski to go to college, and it was a huge deal for them, only for Mae to turn around and, as her mom puts it, take all that work, all that money, all that time spent saving and just throw it away. I can understand why she feels this way, especially knowing the pressure to go to college and achieve success under capitalism can be quite strong in working class or low income families, as well as immigrant families. And Mae isn't communicating what's actually going on with her very well. But with the way her mom tells it, it sounds like Mae going to college was more something she did out of obligation, or because she could do it, so she thought she was supposed to, rather than something she actually wanted to do. But who's to say? Mae's father seems to have had multiple jobs throughout his adult life, which isn't uncommon, especially for working-class people. He was a miner in particular for a pretty substantial amount of time before the mines shut down. Being a miner was a union job, which means he at least had certain protections and rights in place that were fought for that aren't there at his new supermarket job at the Ham Pan. In the epilogue, if we talk to him as Mae, he talks about hating his job and how they just don't respect you for working. Which, as someone who has worked retail, I completely get how that feels, but I also think under capitalism, nowhere really respects you for working. They may pretend to, but that respect is always conditional, which means it's not real respect. Speaking of unions and mining, Mae and B come across an old article at the library about some miners going on strike to protest unsafe working conditions. This was presumably before they had a union. The National Guard was sent in because that's a completely normal response to workers striking. That's sarcasm, by the way. And some kids ended up throwing stones at the soldiers, who then opened fire. They killed 2 kids who were there because they were delivering food to their family members who were striking. One was 7 years old and the other was 9. This feels like it might actually be a reference to Palestine, and how so many Palestinian kids have been arrested or even killed by the IOF for stone throwing. But this actually prompted the bosses to finally agree to the demands of the strikers. It's horrifying, though, how it took dead children to get the bosses to actually treat their workers like human beings, but I'm not surprised. They find another article in the library about another set of miners in the 1800s who were being stolen from by their boss, who was skimming workers of their pay. They confronted him, and he assaulted the miners' leader, causing him to lose a tooth. The article states that, quote, the miners knew how much his tooth meant to him and descended on the boss, unquote. They held him down and pulled all his teeth out with pliers, which is honestly kind of a slay. Like, I think we should assault our bosses more often when they're shitty. For legal reasons, this is a joke. The miners ended up starting a secret society with those teeth, passing them out as signs of membership. The secret society was basically community organizing, but kind of creepy and weird. Quote, the teeth were passed out to the miners, and a secret society was created with a vow to protect the other workers' interests. Membership was based on owning one of these teeth, and each was marked with a symbol of their choosing. These symbols were used around the coal patch to organize meetings and make announcements. The boss survived the attack, but never named his attackers in fear of implicating himself. When he died a few years later, members dug up his grave to retrieve his skull. It was used in ceremonies performed before going out for retribution. All would gather around, place their teeth into the sockets, and later retrieve their tooth after the retribution was completed. End quote. When Mae finds a tooth in her granddad's old safe, it's heavily implied that he might have belonged to this secret society, depending on how long it went on for. Mae's dad also laments about not being able to fully provide for his family, and not having any time to do anything else, or being able to give Mae's mom the time and money to have her own hobbies. It's significant that under patriarchy, he most likely has internalized the idea of the father as the main provider of the family, whose responsibility it is to take care of his wife and child, and he feels like he's failing at it. But it's not his fault. It's the fault of the company that makes him work 8 or more hours a day, almost every day, or sometimes every day for very little pay. It's the fault of capitalism for forcing people to work to live in the first place, just so they can keep their houses or their health insurance, or put food on the table. Many people seem to be unhappy in Possum Springs, and have the intense urge to leave it. Bea, Greg, and Angus all express the desire to leave, with Bea feeling like she's trapped, which in some ways she is. Lori M. is only 15, and she already has plans to leave and go to film school to make horror movies. Greg mentions that no one even tries to talk you out of leaving, and how everything has failed him and Angus. And I would argue that that's true, although it's less about the town itself and more about capitalism as a whole, as well as Western individualism and the alienation it brings, as well as queerphobia. Selmers, Mae's neighbor, performs a poem at the library on how there's no reception in Possum Springs that is actually a critique of broader capitalist society as a whole. And I feel like this is a good example of showcasing how Possum Springs is just a microcosm for the US and arguably the world as a whole. And I would argue that people would probably hate living in small towns a lot less if we abolished capitalism, as well as other systems of oppression like cis-heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, and ableism. Also, if those of us in the West were less individualistic and more collective, and had a better sense of community. The truth is, at the end of the day, it's just a place. It's not alive, and it's not hurting them. But you know what actually is? The whole. So now here's the part of the video where I need to bring up the murder cult. At the end of Act 2, after the Harfest play, Mae sees a teenager get kidnapped by a hooded figure. She yells for help, but to no avail, so she impulsively decides to chase after whatever it was she saw. She chases them to the end of the parking lot behind the old food donkey, and watches them disappear past the fence and over the hill. When her Aunt Molly, who is also a cop, finds her, she obviously doesn't believe what Mae saw. Typical. Although, if I am reluctantly going to be somewhat fair to Molly here, Mae does tell her that she just saw a ghost. And that is somewhat hard to swallow. I think it's interesting how a lot of the third act is centered around two things: Mae's deteriorating health, and nobody believing what she's seen. I think this is particularly interesting from a disability standpoint because we are often gaslit about our experiences, or automatically assumed to just be exaggerating, hallucinating, or straight up making things up. I don't think her friends mean to make her feel belittled and unheard, but it definitely has that effect. Part of the reason she strongly seems to feel that it's a ghost seems to be because of her nightmares. Now, Mae has been having nightmares ever since the night of the failed party at the end of Act 1. That usually involve you as the player having to find things as Mae, or interact with things by smashing them. It's hard for me to say exactly what her nightmares are supposed to represent because I'm just too autistic for that shit, and also I think maybe they aren't supposed to be read as perfect one-to-one metaphors for anything. But there are definitely clues to Mae's mental state within them, particularly the first one and the last one. Now, you can read Mae's conversations with the maybe god of her nightmares, and her worsening headaches and exhaustion in a number of ways. You can read it as purely supernatural, and you can read the black goat and the hole as real. Or you can read it all as a manifestation of her mental distress, and Mae reading into things regarding the cult and making connections that aren't really there because of the toll what she's been seeing has been taking on her. Or you could read it as a combination of both. But I'm less concerned with that for this particular video, and I'm more concerned with examining the cult and the black goat specifically as a metaphor for capitalism. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So basically, several nights of ghost investigating later, and Mae and her friends are all out in the woods, ready to investigate and put an end to this thing once and for all. None of them except Mae really believe it's a ghost, but they still think something weird is definitely going on, and they want to support her. So they all end up in the woods late at night. Super great plan, y'all. I can't possibly see how this could go wrong. And they stumble upon not a ghost, but a group of people in dark hoods getting ready to murder a man as punishment for screwing up. I mean, we can't be entirely sure that that's what's happening, since all the violence is taking place off screen, but I'm like 95% sure. I think his leg was stuck in a trap of some kind, and they either freed it so they could transport him, or they just cut it off, but I'm not entirely sure. Anyways, remember the severed arm that was left outside the Click-Clack? Well, it turns out that the severed arm that Mae and her friends stumble upon after leaving the Click-Clack diner belonged to one of the people the cult was sacrificing, and Lerv was the man who dropped it there, much to the displeasure of his fellow cult members. Said cult members talk about having supposedly no choice in this, I call bullshit, and they worry about the fate of the town. Now, the murder cult is about to get all murdery on Lerv, when Mae accidentally interrupts them by making a sound, and she and the others need to run like hell for their lives. Mae ends up getting shot by one of them, and somehow ends up in the hospital instead of dead, even though the cult was right on her trail. But my guess is maybe they weren't trying to kill Mae, they just didn't want her to talk. And I think this is more or less confirmed later on. Basically, fast forward a bit, and Mae eventually wakes up from the coma she was in, wobbles to Greg and Angus's apartment in critical condition, and crashes there for a bit, before having the heart-to-heart I mentioned earlier on the couch, with either B or Greg, about her mental distress. Then, for whatever reason, she leaves the apartment when her friends are all asleep and ventures back out into the woods. I can see why she feels like she needs to handle this herself on some level. She has a tendency to isolate herself with her problems and not ask for help when she needs it, but this is still really stupid. And her friends call her out on it when they catch up with her. Either Greg or B, whoever you mostly hung out with, tells Mae essentially that she's not alone and that they're not going to let her die on them. Mae says that she has to follow the cult member she saw down into the mines, that it's just something she has to see through. She feels responsible, or at least connected to what's going on. So she and her friends go down into the mines, and by the way, I think it's significant that this is taking place in the mines that used to be the heart of Possum Springs' economy, but then they shut it down. But more on that later. And they come face to face, or not so literally, because the cult members' faces are hidden, with the cult and what exactly they're worshipping. The Black Goat. A living supernatural entity of some sort. Is it a god? A demon? It's a little unclear. It's a hole in the mines, or maybe more accurately, it is the hole. And they have been sacrificing so-called undesirables to it for years. This has actually been going on for decades now. One of the cultists explains how, essentially, back in the 90s, a couple of men came to the old mine after it was sealed off to try bootlegging, and even built a new elevator for it, which is probably how Mae and the others managed to get down in a working elevator. Supposedly, one of these men walked off the edge and fell into the hole and was never seen or heard from again. But that's when the other man heard the voice of the Black Goat. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I view the Black Goat as a metaphor for capitalism and the other oppressive systems of violence it manufactures. I came to this conclusion for a number of reasons, mainly because of what the cultists say about why they're doing what they're doing and who they're sacrificing. They complain about the government spending their taxes on lazy people and immigrants. This is another case of misdirected blame and resentment, like I mentioned earlier. People will not only blame the disabled, but also other vulnerable, marginalized people, like immigrants, people on welfare, addicts, and homeless people. They also mentioned that the people they picked to sacrifice were people nobody would miss. Drifters, drunks, and delinquents. So essentially, homeless people, addicts, and who knows what their definition of delinquent means, but most likely anyone with a record or any kind of reputation, which puts racialized people, queer people, particularly trans people, and neurodivergent people on the chopping block, due to how biased the police are and how fucked the criminal justice system is. When they sacrificed people, the town would supposedly blossom. Flowers would bloom, the economy boomed, and things apparently stabilized. The cultist describes this as feeding the Black Goat and describes him as hungry like you wouldn't believe. Now, I'm not saying the metaphor is perfect, because it's not, but this reminds me of how, in order for people to find so-called success under capitalism, in order for people to have the privileges they have, other people need to suffer. People are so desperate to maintain their manufactured ideal of the so-called American dream that they're willing to sacrifice those they believe deserving of their fate. In the real world, it might be less hands-on, less literal, but make no mistake, people are being killed every day. They're killed by poverty, by Western imperialism, by genocide, by ableism, and racism and transphobia, and all the different isms and phobias. And make no mistake, if there was an actual hole to throw us into, I think some people would try. Now, this gets a little muddy if we think about how in Night in the Woods these sacrifices are rewarded with the town prospering, at least according to the cultists. Whereas in the real world, capitalism doesn't really work for anybody except for the super rich, the ruling class, if you will. Even the people who seem to think they're doing fine could be doing better if they just let themselves imagine a better world. A world where labor isn't mandatory to live, and workers control the means of production. But anyways, enough of the minor communist rant. It gets even worse when Mae realizes that the cultists killed Casey Hartley, her friend who Greg had thought just hopped a train and left town, but his parents clearly thought he was missing. He was dead the whole time. The cultists tried to justify it by saying he wasn't going to contribute anything to society and that they did him a favor, which is utterly horrifying. They talk about how he was getting involved in criminal activity, and that was probably going to get him killed anyways, as if that somehow justifies them murdering him. This genuinely scares me because I know that there are people who actually think like this, who actually believe this. When Mae calls them monsters, they tell her they do it because they love their home. And this particular line also shook me, because I've been in situations before where bigoted, homophobic people came before my town council and talked about how much they loved their town and how proud they were to live here, before they went on to say some homophobic shit, fully solidifying the clear underlying meaning of their earlier words. This isn't my home. I don't belong here. It's theirs. And it hurts. This was Casey's home too. It's Greg's home and Mae's home and Selmer's home and all the other residents of Possum Springs, even the undesirable ones. I do think it's interesting though how Mae doesn't seem to qualify on the cultist list as one of those people, even though she is jobless and disabled. although I think this could probably be because of her family name. Whiteness strikes again. The cultists also mention how they have to kill people to keep the town from dying, and I'm reminded at this point of a quote from an autistic TikToker, actually Autistic Katie. This world is not worth saving if we have to sacrifice poor and disabled people to do it. They talk about the jobs and kids leaving and Possum Springs eventually just being fields and trees, which is interesting, because if we continue with the capitalism metaphor, then if you don't feed the beast, so to speak, then we could read this as nature reclaiming the land from colonialism and capitalism, and wiping out Possum Springs to begin anew. This also reminds me of another point from the piece written by Stephen R. Gray-Gibb. He mentions that, quote, "In Detroit, whole neighborhoods have been razed to the ground in the hopes that the forest will return to reclaim the depressing blight of post-industrial decline," end quote. So perhaps the destruction of Possum Springs is its natural conclusion. If we read the cultists as being stuck in the past, which I believe is quite obvious, being nostalgic for a time long gone, that wasn't really so great for everyone anyways, the parallels between them and Mae and her fear of change are particularly interesting. When Mae finally speaks with what may or may not be the Black Goat, or a different supernatural entity, or god of some kind, I don't know, man, I think I'm just too autistic for this part. After the cultists let them go with the threat that if they tell anybody about this, they know who Mae and her friends are out in the real world and they can hurt them. She tells it, "I know what you are now. I think I knew before. But you know, after I sent that kid to the hospital years ago, they said I had an anger problem. But that's not true. I was angry because of something else. Something I'd lost." This comparison is also brought up directly by Mae herself when they leave, when she describes the cultists as losing what they thought was going to happen, which was what happened a long time ago, or how they remember it, or picture it. I mentioned earlier that Mae has a lot of nostalgia for the Possum Springs she knew before she went off to school, and seems to be afraid of things changing, or at least resistant to change. I also theorized that Mae might be afraid of things changing because of her current mental distress and issues with disassociation. She mentions that she was angry because of something she lost. It's hard to say exactly what this is, whether she's referring to her childhood or so-called sanity, which who's to say if that's something she ever really had, or even something that actually exists. Or perhaps simpler times. But regardless, she continues on by saying, "Trying so hard since not to be angry got me all defenseless, and I lost more and more and more. That's not getting better." And unfortunately, she's kind of right. Regardless of whether she's talking about the nostalgia of childhood or longing for a time when she was healthier and more mentally well, or maybe more accurately happier in our current society under capitalism and all the crap it produces, things won't really get better. But that doesn't mean you should ever give up and stop fighting. And that doesn't mean you won't still have bright spots where things are just a little bit better for just a little while. This world can be shitty and painful, but it can also be wonderful and beautiful. And more importantly, Mae touches on how her anger is actually an important part of her, an important thing to acknowledge instead of burying like her doctor told her to. Trying so hard not to be angry, which is futile because it's impossible, made her defenseless. Mae then states that she wants to be angry, as she should. Anger is a healthy and natural emotion. It's there to tell you that something's wrong, usually that you or someone you care about is experiencing injustice. Anger helps you fight back. One thing I will say about this game is that I think it unfortunately naturalizes feeling powerless and like everything is meaningless, and we live in an uncaring universe. Like it's just a normal part of life that you have to get used to. But no, it isn't, and you don't. It's capitalism. It's Western individualism that breeds alienation. And those things are not only unnatural, they are also fixable. When Mae says, "I'm so scared all the time," and the fear hurts, feeling like everything is over, was over before I got here. So long, hiding or trying to outrun this. I get it. This won't stop until I die. I think it's safe to say that this existential feeling of dread or fear she seems to be expressing would be less of a problem if we didn't live under late-stage capitalism, and if she didn't live in a country that prioritizes and preaches individualism. Not to mention, if we didn't live in a world rife with ableism and saneism that pathologizes certain brain types and traumatizes them for existing, which then in turn breeds signs of mental illness or distress. I'm not trying to speak generally here, but I know for autism specifically, most of what society is familiar with as quote-unquote symptoms of autism are actually signs of autistic distress or unhappiness because we're not in a good environment. But honestly, who is? Because to be honest, nobody seems to be doing great right now, except for like billionaires. But anyways, moving on. The line, "feeling like everything's over, was over before I got here," is interesting because if you read this as her broadly talking about Possum Springs' future, or maybe even the world's future, you can also connect this to capitalism. Honestly, people should probably be taking a shot or a sip of water every time I say capitalism in this video, and how it bleeds certain places dry, particularly the Rust Belt in this case. But this implies that things were good or at least stable before Mae was born, which I would argue based on what I've heard and read at least, no, it wasn't. But regardless, Mae is afraid, and honestly, me too, girl. Life as a neurodivergent or mad person, particularly when you are gendered as a woman, is scary in this world, in this society. There's a lot to be afraid of, but I think Mae, in particular, is afraid of not just change or losing things, her friends, her town, herself, but I think she's also afraid of things not being real, or no longer being real. No longer meaning anything. I think she's afraid that one day everything will just be shapes. And it makes sense for her to feel this way as someone dealing with severe disassociation and derealization. But in the face of her fears, in the face of the possibility of losing everything, of things disappearing or changing, she doesn't deny that those things will eventually happen, because of course they will. Change is inevitable and nothing lasts forever. But to borrow a phrase, a thing isn't beautiful because it lasts. She tells the black goat, "But when I die, I want it to hurt. When my friends leave, when I have to let go, when this entire town is wiped off the map, I want it to hurt bad. I want to lose. I want to get beaten up. I want to hold on until I'm thrown off and everything ends. Because you know what? Until that happens, I want to hope again. And I want it to hurt. Because that means it meant something. It means I am something, at least." In the face of a meaningless, empty existence, she claims her meaning. She is real, she exists, and that matters. Now, all of this is well and good, but Mae's problems, just like all of our problems, are not just individual, they are collective. I've already spoken about the major issues in our society that cause a lot of our problems, both collective and individual. So what do? How do we fix it? Well, to be honest, I'm not exactly sure. We can have these goals like abolish capitalism or change the world and make things better, end ableism, queerphobia, racism, etc. But if you're anything like me, it can be difficult to imagine how to get there, especially when you're dealing with mental illness or distress, especially when you're disabled, and especially if you struggle to seek out and maintain community like me, because you're traumatized. But the thing about self-isolation is it doesn't actually keep you safe. It feels like it does, but it doesn't. It just lets you marinate in your suffering and your trauma and stay stuck. It stops you from fighting back. One of the crucial things this game focuses on is the importance of community, particularly in the face of mental distress, not just friendship, but a larger community. Working class solidarity, even though that's sort of devolved over the years. The conversations between Lori M. and Mae, and Selmers and Mae, are great examples of neurodivergent solidarity. The conversations between Mae and people like Mr. Chazikov as they explore the stars, Selmers as she shows Mae her poetry, Lori M. and her love of horror and trains and how she wants to share that with Mae, and Germ and his weirdly refreshing oddities. People like Pastor K and Bruce and even the random townies of Possum Springs. They are all examples of a collective community. It gives Mae, and you as the player, the chance to hear their stories and learn about them as people, not just shapes. Capitalism isolates you. It breeds individualism. But the truth is we need each other. Maybe not to fix our flaws like we're broken, but to heal them. To change and grow and make something new. To find new ways of doing things. Things like going to protests, joining socialist organizations, starting community gardens, volunteering, etc. are all important, but I think it's also important to just know each other, to understand each other. And that's scary if you're anything like me, the idea of being known, of figuring out how to trust people and ask for help. The idea that you deserve to be helped, to be loved. It's hard for me to grasp, but I'm working on it. I also know it can be hard to trust your neighbors when you know all too well some of them would gladly throw you into the hole to live another day, or just because they think you deserve it. I think sometimes you have to figure out who you can trust and go from there. It's hard being a revolutionary socialist when you're a pessimist and you have massive trust issues. Sometimes you just have to take it one day at a time and learn that sometimes you can't do it all alone. Nor should you. Nor should anyone. Mae tries to face her problems alone, keeping the nature of why she had to leave college a secret from everyone until the final act of the game, and trying to leave her friends at night to deal with the cult in the woods by herself. But not only does that not work, or who knows how she would have fared dealing with the cultist by herself, but my guess is not great. But her friends don't let her go into the woods alone. What Greg in particular says to Mae, if you've taken Greg's route and hung out with him the most, I think is really significant, and it really gets to me. He tells Mae, you don't get to do this, okay? I don't get everything that's going on with you, and I'm not saying it's not happening. I believe you, okay? I do. But you don't get to die on me. You're not going to do that to me, okay? Reading that as a neurodivergent person just really warms my heart and makes me all emotional and shit. Because I want to hear that people are here for me, even if they don't understand what's going on with me. And that what I'm experiencing is real, and that I'm not alone. B says something similar if you've taken her route, but for whatever reason, Greg's lines make me more emotional. And I think that's probably because it can be read as an expression of neurodivergent solidarity, just like a lot of Mae's conversations with Lori M. But they refuse to abandon her. They refuse to let her face whatever she's facing alone, and I think that gives her hope, or at least the desire to have hope. And when Mae says that she wants to hope again, it always strikes an emotional chord within me, because I want that too. And I do have hope, sometimes, and anger, and fear, just like Mae. But I think all of those are essentially healthy human emotions, at least in moderation. Things don't last. We get hurt and we lose things. But that doesn't mean that this life isn't still worth participating in anyways. It doesn't mean that there aren't still things worth fighting for. So do it scared, do it bleeding and bruised and exhausted, but do it anyway. And don't do it alone. Thank you so much for watching this video essay. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to give it a like, a comment, and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one.